Yeah, am I on? Yeah, all right, why don't we get started? Thanks, everyone. This is, welcome to the first official panel of this symposium. Some people have been asking, unsurprisingly, the opening session with Alex and Jamie Raskin was just terrific. Some people are asking when the video will be available. Everybody who's registered will receive an email tomorrow with the YouTube link, so it will be up very soon for you to share with your friends. Okay, so the purpose of this opening panel is to set the stage for our deliberations tomorrow by considering some of the arguments for and against the Electoral College, to have a little bit of an overview of some of the efforts to change the Electoral College, which have been playing out almost since the Electoral College was established, and then to talk about some of the ideas about reform directions. So we have three fantastic panelists who will offer remarks for about the next 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for question and answer. Just brief introductions, because the era of introductions can be more economical with the advent of the internet. The first speaker is George Edwards, who's a distinguished fellow and Oxford University distinguished professor and Jordan Chair Emeritus of Texas A&M University. Has written, among other works, a very compelling book titled Why the Electoral College is Bad for America. The second will be my friend and colleague, Daniel Allen, who is the James Bryant Conant University professor here and the director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation. She is, I think everybody knows, a professor of political philosophy, ethics, public policy, also a remarkable leader outside of the academy, and a democracy advocate. She's written many, many books, including very recently, Justice by Means of Democracy and Democracy in the Time of Coronavirus, which I recommend both those books to everyone who hasn't had a chance to look at them. And then third, batting cleanup, talking about the historical dimensions of reform, is Alex Kazar. So maybe let me hand it over to George.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to use the podium. And thank you, Archon, and thank you and Alex for organizing this conference. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. And I think as a point of departure, we can all agree that the Electoral College violates political equality, and that's probably why we're here in the first place. Favoring some citizens over others, depending solely, solely upon the state in which they cast their votes for president. And of course, that allows the candidate who comes in second in the popular vote to win the election. And these consequences are indisputable. It's simple arithmetic. So there's really not a big debate about that. The question becomes, does the Electoral College offer compensations for violating the most deeply ingrained democratic principles? Now, defenders of the Electoral College say that it does, that it provides important benefits to the American polity, and that it protects the nation from the dire consequences of direct election of the president. Now, it's important to note that defenders of the Electoral College, excuse me, I'm going to make a sound here. Yeah, trying to clear my throat. I apologize. It's important to note that defenders of the Electoral College virtually never engage in rigorous arguments or offer systematic evidence on behalf of their claims. Instead, they make unsupported assertions, which unfortunately have been accepted by many people. So if we're effectively to advocate reform, it's crucial that we have answers to their claims. I will briefly run through these and be happy to go into more detail and response to your questions. But along the way, I want you to note a striking irony. And that is that in reality, the consequences of both the Electoral College and direct election of the president are exactly the opposite of what Electoral College advocates claim. And I want to say that again, exactly the opposite. And you'll see what I mean as we progress. Now let's start at the beginning. We spent a couple of minutes already at the beginning with the origins. Some argue that we should simply defer to the wisdom of the framers. In effect, concluding they knew what they were doing when they established the Electoral College. They were wise men, of course, they were only men, and therefore, end of discussion. But of course, we now know that that's nonsense. There was no coherent theory or coherent design for the Electoral College came together at the last moment. There were many motivations for the Electoral College. Some wanted to protect against mob rule. Some wanted to protect slave interests, a wide range of interests. What is really important here is that all the intentions are now irrelevant. They're just irrelevant. But more importantly, the Electoral College doesn't work at all as the framers intended. So it makes no sense to defer to such a plan. So I think we can move on. Okay, the framers were concerned about tyranny of the majority. So they incorporated a number of rules in the Constitution, as no doubt you know, that require supermajorities to take action, such as requirement for 2/3 of the senators present to ratify a treaty. Okay, is the Electoral College's violation of majority rule just another example of such constitutional provisions? It is not. The framers designed all but one of the Constitution's extra majority provisions to enable minorities to prevent action, to stop something from happening. The Electoral College is different. It allows a minority to take an action, that is, to select the president. As such, it is the only device of its kind in the Constitution. So the Electoral College does not prevent tyranny of the majority. Instead, it provides the potential for tyranny of the minority. Now, the Electoral College is organized by state. And you might think, well, it's an essential element of American federalism, as defenders of the Electoral College claim. But the Electoral College is not a federal principle. The founders never discuss it, not once, not one sentence, did they ever discuss it as a federal principle. And they did not expect electors to act as state agents. And at the very beginning, they did not act as state agents. The Electoral College does not enhance the sovereignty or the power of states. Federalism is based on representation in Congress and the Constitution's allocation of powers to the states, not on the Electoral College. Now, perhaps the core justification for the Electoral College, as Congressman Raskin said, is that it balances local and national interests, protecting small states from the majoritarian politics. So there's a number of questions we need to ask here. Do states require protection? Well, first of all, it's not clear what might be protected. States have no interest as states in the election of the president. Only citizens do. States do not embody coherent, unified interest to protect. Even the smallest state has substantial diversity of interest and opinion within it. Nor is there a need for protection, given the many constraints that the Constitution places on the acts that simple majorities can take, given the Senate's extraordinary representation of small states, and given the Senate's filibuster and power to thwart majorities, it strains credulity to argue that certain geographically concentrated interests require additional protection from the majoritarian political process. Collectively, states with small populations do not have common interests to protect. Instead, they represent a great diversity of core economic interests, as Congressman Raskin pointed out. Some are red, some are blue. So it's not surprising they don't vote as a bloc in Congress, and it's not surprising they don't vote as a bloc for president. The great political battles of American history have been over ideology and economic power, rather than small states versus large states. There never has been such a battle. Well, do candidates campaign across the country and attend to small states and attend to small state interests in their campaigns? Well, in my book, I provide, I would say, an extraordinary amount of detailed information that will bore you beyond comprehension. But at any rate, it's there if you're interested. And for every election in this century and some elections in the last century. But let me just use as an illustration 2016. 95% of the campaign visits were in 14 states, representing about 1/3 of the population of the country. 57% of all the campaigning by candidates occurred in 4 states, 4: Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Among the small states, only New Hampshire, Iowa, and Nevada received any attention. So we can then ask, well, okay, maybe they don't show up personally, but maybe they run ads, talking about the interest of these states. Well, the fact is that they don't. they don't compensate in that way. In 2016, just to continue the example, 99% of all campaign ad spending was in 14 states, the same 14 battleground states, and 71% of all of the advertising was in 4 states. That's where the campaign took place. So the Electoral College distorts the political process by providing an incentive to visit competitive states, especially large competitive states. Now, I want to just make a couple of other comments here. Congress is designed to be responsive to constituency interests, and it is magnificent at responding to constituency interests. We have to agree. The president, as James Madison pointed out, is to take a broader view when he proclaimed that the presidents act for the people, not the states. When advocates of the electoral system express concern that direct election of the president would suppress local interests in favor of the broader national interest, they're supporting a presidency responsive to parochial interests and a system already prone to gridlock, and which offers minority interests extraordinary access to policymakers and opportunities to thwart the policies that they oppose. Now, according to supporters of Electoral College, one of its primary virtues is that winning candidates must obtain concurrent majorities around the country to win. Very interesting concept. If states do not employ the unit rule, allocating all their electoral votes as a block, the argument goes, candidates might appeal to clusters of voters whose votes could be aggregated across the nation, across states, across regions. So they argue this would be highly divisive because the coalition behind a candidate might represent only one strata of society and not the other strata of society. Interesting idea. They also claim that forcing presidential candidates to seek broad support helps maintain national harmony, a good thing, and provides the president a mandate for governing. So we have to ask the question, because these are empirical questions. Do candidates try to build broad coalitions by appealing to voters throughout the nation? Well, except in a superficial fashion, we know that they don't. We've seen that both candidates of both parties ignore large areas of the country. Do winning candidates actually win support across regions? Well, anyone examining the red and blue states on election night knows that candidates tend to win with strong regional support. Even more interesting, excuse me, we can ask, do winning candidates receive majority support across social strata? Are they getting those concurrent majorities? Is that a justification for inverting majority rule? Well, let's take the last time that happened in 2016. And by the way, it's even more exaggerated if I review the data for 2000. But listen, Donald Trump won a smaller, I emphasize, smaller percentage than Hillary Clinton of the votes of women, Blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, those voted aged 18 to 44, those with very low incomes and those with less than $50,000 annual household income, college graduates and those with graduate degrees, Jews, liberals, moderates, urbanites, and those living in the East and the West. So once again, it strains credulity to claim that Trump's vote represents concurrent majorities across the major strata of American society. What actually happened in 2000 and 2016 was that the Electoral College imposed a candidate supported by white male Protestants, the dominant social group in the country, over the objections not only of a plurality of all voters, but also the most prominent minority interests in the country. Now, what about mandates? Well, I've done a lot of research on mandates. Presidents rarely receive a mandate to govern to begin with. Donald Trump was no exception in 2016. As you know, he received 46% of the vote. He lost to Hillary Clinton by 3 million in the popular vote. After the election, just 29% of the public said Trump had a mandate to carry out the agenda he presented in the campaign. So much for a mandate. Now let's move from the supposed benefits of the Electoral College, the positive benefits, to the charges against direct election. that the Electoral College supposedly protects us against. And the first is, and perhaps the most significant, is that direct election would fragment and polarize the party system. It's the presence of a runoff that's at the heart of this matter. For some reason, advocates of the Electoral College assume that there has to be a runoff if you have direct election, which of course is not true. Nevertheless, opponents of direct election charge that under it, third parties could accumulate votes across states, as we have seen. As a result, they have an incentive to run candidates for president and hope they've been able to track enough votes, along with those of other splinter parties, to prevent either of the two major party candidates from winning, let us say, 40% of the vote, whatever the standard would be, and thus force a runoff. And in a runoff, the argument goes, the third parties would be in a position to extract concessions, and the argument is extremist concessions in return for their support. But as I said, this is all premised on a runoff, which we do not need to have. And I might add, in all of American history, only one candidate is, in terms of popular vote, has failed to receive 40%, and that's Abraham Lincoln, when he got 39.8% of the vote in 1860, and that was because he wasn't on the ballot in a good many states, as you probably know. At any rate, in the absence of a runoff, there's no question that direct election discourages splinter parties. And a direct election, you have to win the whole country to get anything. Coming in second or third gains you nothing, no office and no leverage in the selection of the president. So you can't leverage a few electoral votes to dictate the choice of president because there aren't any electoral votes. And there's no possibility of deadlocking the election by winning a small percentage, because whoever comes in first is going to win. So as a result, direct election would discourage splinter parties. By contrast, under the unit rule, under the Electoral College, it encourages third parties and provides incentives for regional candidates like Strom Thurmond in 1948, George Wallace in 1968, because under the Electoral College, winning a few states, just a few states, may put a third party in a position to dictate the outcome of the entire election. Because you can instruct your electors to support one candidate or the other candidate, or in a contingent election in the House by influencing the vote of representatives of those states that those candidates won. In addition, and we talked about this a little bit already, no matter what its motivation for running, under the Electoral College, a third party can tip the balance in a closely contested state by siphoning just a few votes from the major party candidate, and thus determine the result. There's little question, as we have already discussed, that Ralph Nader cost Al Gore the election. The preferred candidate in Florida between the two was clearly Al Gore. Between Bush and Gore was Al Gore. More broadly, the Electoral College is not the basis of the two-party system. Single-member districts and plurality election are. And the nation would be one electoral district under direct election of the president. So direct election would not splinter the party system. Now, in this century, and we had a good question about this earlier, the 11 largest states have had a majority of the electoral vote. So some critics claim that under direct election, big states would select the president no matter what the other states thought. Only the big states would matter. Now, the only way this could happen, of course, is for everybody, or overwhelmingly, the voters in the big states to vote one way. So it's an empirical question again. How do they actually vote? Well, the total votes for the 11 largest states don't skew in one direction. No candidate has won more than 51% of the vote in the 11 largest states combined in this century. That's the first thing. It's not the case, of course, that big states are Democratic bastions. A majority of the big states, of course, are quite competitive. Thus, there's no danger of large states determining the election outcome by themselves. Equally important, and this is just a fun fact, equally important, under the Electoral College, a candidate could win the presidency by winning 50% plus one vote of the popular vote in the 11 largest states under the Electoral College. They could, if everyone else in the nation voted against them, everyone else in the nation, they could still win the presidency with 1/4 of the national vote. That's the fun fact. I don't expect that to happen, but it is kind of interesting. 7 of the largest states voted for Donald Trump in 2016. So what happens is, as is usually the case, it's exactly the opposite of the claim. Under the Electoral College, big states can dominate. What about big city dominance? Big cities can't even control the states in which they're located, much less the nation. Texas has 20 of the largest cities in the United States. Many of them vote Democratic, thank God. And at present, they have no statewide elected Democrats at all. I'm a blue person in a red state, which makes me even bluer. But at any rate, that's just an aside, and has nothing to do with the Electoral College. At any rate, cities simply aren't big enough to control politics in America. If you combine the population of the 20 largest cities, it's about 11-12% of the population of the country. Okay, so what would happen then? We had a question about campaigning under direct election, and advocates of the Electoral College argue, well, you know, the candidates will only go to large urban areas. Well, as we've already seen, this is nonsense. Since every vote counts, you'd have an incentive to appeal to voters all across the country. So presidential candidates would be much more attentive to small states and minorities. I live in a big state. I live in Texas. It's 800 miles across. So do candidates for governor only campaign in those 6 large cities that I was talking about? Well, of course not. That's nonsense. And anyone could observe that. If you actually care about the answer to the question, you can actually look where people campaign. It's not that hard. Moreover, the cost of advertising is mainly a function of market size. So it doesn't cost more to reach 10,000 voters in Wyoming than it does in Queens or Los Angeles. It probably costs less. So voters in small population centers are more cost effective for campaigns to target with advertising. Now, it's possible, of course, that candidates would want to spend time in large urban areas, naturally campaigning and getting free time on TV. But this would do nothing to undermine the argument against the Electoral College. Small states cannot be worse off than they are now. You cannot do worse than nothing, right? They get no attention now. They're going to get some attention under direct election because there's more incentives to visit small states, to visit large states, which are ignored. Who goes to California to campaign? Who goes to New York to campaign? Does that seem like a sensible thing right now? So direct election would disperse campaign efforts rather than depriving states of them. Now, what would happen if you actually had this kind of campaigning? Well, first of all, you'd stimulate party building efforts in the weaker party, especially in less competitive states, and encourage both parties to campaign actively. And increased mobilization efforts leads to increased turnout levels. And we know about this. We understand these things. Moreover, people are more likely to vote if they think their vote matters. Shock, right? Voters exposed to campaigns, by the way, actually know more about the candidates and their issue stances. So you'd have a more informed electorate. And increased competition across the nation would reduce the power of sectionalism in politics and encourage candidates to focus their attention on the entire nation. And I want to emphasize this, and that includes racial and ethnic minorities who are largely ignored right now. We had a discussion. I was glad that point. So I've got one other point. That we have to address, and that's about fraud. Because supporters of the Electoral College often argue that the direct election of the president would lead to increased fraud and endless recounts and challenges. They reason that the Electoral College localizes fraud in a few states. And because the outcome of those states don't matter, they argue, and of course, who knows, but anyhow, they argue because they don't matter, that candidates don't seek recounts, and that's the end of the story. Now, they say under direct election, if they were close, well, fraud would be an increased problem because you could accumulate a few votes here and a few votes here, and in thousands of precincts across the country. There'd be a massive organization, brilliantly organized, like nothing anyone has ever seen in the history of democracy, to steal 3 or 4 votes at every precinct across the country. And that would be terrible. Well, at any rate, this seems especially ironic in light of the 2020 election, but we have to deal with it. We have to have a response to this. In reality, the Electoral College does not contain the results of fraud. Instead, it magnifies their consequences for the outcome nationally. Under the unit rule of the within the Electoral College, a few votes can change the outcome of an entire state. Think of how many votes you'd had to steal. And I'm not saying anyone stole any votes in Florida in 2000, but it would just take a few votes, and you determine the outcome for the entire nation. So the Electoral College, creates incentive for fraud because you get a large payoff, potentially, from stealing a few votes. What a good deal. That creates an incentive for fraud. Direct election provides a disincentive for fraud. The country is too big and too complex for anyone to know how many additional votes to steal in order to win the entire nation. Moreover, the Electoral College promotes party competition. Excuse me, I said the Electoral College, I didn't mean that. Direct election promotes party competition, which perhaps the best defense against fraud. So the Electoral College violates basic democratic principles, no doubt. And it doesn't offer the country benefits to compensate for this disadvantage. Ironically, as I said earlier, the claims of advantages of Electoral College typically turn out to be advantages of direct election of the president. So one can only conclude that it's time for reform. Thank you.
Danielle, do you
All right.
here or up there, wherever you
I'll
like?
sit here.
Okay.
Yes. I know we've all been sitting for a spell as well, and I have to admit I've got childcare duties that will require me to leave at 6:50. So in that regard, I'm going to be brief in my comments. And I want to say three things. First, to say one of the biggest challenges of tackling this question of the Electoral College is the fact that we're doing so at a point in time when it's definitely broken. It's dysfunctional because the size of the House of Representatives was capped 100 years ago. And so the Electoral College and the House both should have grown consistently over time as the population grew. The consequence of this is that the weighting, the relative balance between small states and big states has changed over time. Hence the increasing frequency of the divergence between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. That is a real problem. The system is simply broken, and we need to recognize that. That said, that doesn't answer the question of whether or not the right solution is to get rid of the Electoral College or, for example, to uncap the House, let it grow again, get back to having a functional Electoral College as a mechanism, doing what it was designed to do at one level, namely protect smaller states. And I'll say more about that in a second. So I would disagree with the idea that it's a myth that there's protection to be had there. It is true that the Electoral College was also founded for other reasons, elitist reasons, as we've heard. And certainly the original weighting, because of the 3/5 clause, absolutely established a slave republic. But that fact, which depends on the demographic contingency and that constitutional peculiarity, doesn't actually answer the question of whether an Electoral College as such, when the principle is this question of the role of states, is valuable or not. It really is the question of states and their role in our institutions that is at stake here. It's the only question, really. Do we think states still matter or not? You just made a case that a state interest is non-existent, that there's no compelling reason to think that geographical co-location gives people any meaningful kind of shared interest. I don't think that's accurate, but I think that's exactly the kind of question we should be debating and coming to a view about, because at the end of the day, that really is, I think, where the question turns. Second thing I want to do is say a couple of points about some of the claims, about direct election and how that connects to this question. It was great hearing Jamie talking about campaigning in Massachusetts. I'm like, that's not what it was like, my friend, having run for statewide office in Massachusetts. I can tell you that that was an inaccurate description of the situation. Jamie was right on like everything else. There's a couple of things I disagree with him on, but he was not correct about campaigning in Massachusetts. One of my favorite things somebody said to me at a Democratic town committee meeting in Western Mass was, Well, it's like everybody just ignores Western Mass. I mean, everybody. Have you seen how they report the weather in the state? The weatherman stands in front of Western Massachusetts, right? So you can't even see, like, you're part of the state. You're trying to see the weather. And that is the consistent experience of people in the less populous parts of our state. Candidates do not come. Elected officials do not come. Direct election in a single district, candidates prioritize their time. Small states will be badly off on either system. On either system. I don't think there's improvement to be had for small states via direct election. So then why is it that people in small states do tend, like Lynn Cheney, to think that there's value in the Electoral College? Jamie actually conceded the point. I don't know if you guys spotted it, but he did. He conceded the point. He said, well, she does get those 2 extra senators as a part of the delegation. Yeah, that's right. Amplification of voice. That's all it is. Amplification of voice, but it's real. And that's why, again, the system's broken now, because the weighting of the amplification has gotten too big for small states, but it is real. And so then when you have the picture of what does the country think about our election, small states' voices are amplified. That's the value at that specific level. So, all right, then actually my friend Alex conceded the other point in his remarks when he was making the case about the instability of the interstate compact system. That's the whole point, that instability. So the Electoral College, right, is a design, the purpose of which was to solve for the instability of states' interests constantly shifting in relationship to each other, with the kind of realpolitik concern about the balance of power among states. So they got to a solution once, which was the Electoral College, okay? And they locked in a deal for how they were gonna divvy up power. And we're stuck with it, maybe not, because we can't unlock it and make a new deal. Precisely the point of instability that you just made. I'm working right now on trying to make the case for a faculty senate here at Harvard. What's our biggest problem? Medical school has 10,000 faculty, okay? The rest of us have, social sciences, 250, humanities, 250, et cetera. Are we gonna do proportional by person? No way when we're thinking about how we structure this, right? We have to think in some sense about balance among the units. It's exactly the same kind of realpolitik problem among groups that have some meaningful shared interest. So that's why, again, the issue comes back to the state of states in our politics. Do they still, in fact, represent groups of people with some kind of meaningful shared interest? That doesn't mean they all have to vote the same way, but the Republican-Democratic split in Massachusetts will care a lot, like both Republicans and Democrats will care a lot more about what happens to lobsters than the Republican and Democrats in Arizona. So there are, even with ideological splits, there are also geographically specific things that are matters of concern. They may not matter so much anymore. I'm genuinely undecided on this question. It may be the case that our kind of national identity, our party issue defined ways of connecting to politics are the governing feature of our political identities and experiences now. And if that's true, then maybe it's time to say, yeah, the states are just just about your highway signs, and are they green or blue or whatever, nothing significant. On the other hand, it may otherwise be the case that states do still represent meaningful, geographically collocated shared cultures that have a sense of identity and want to speak to that element of shared interest. I don't think we know the answer to that. I think if we're not actually discussing that, we're going to have a hard time resolving the question of whether the Electoral College is the right structure for us to elect that shared executive who can't be from everywhere. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Alex, over to you.
Thank you. I was going to stand up over there, but then I realized that the podium is now like at one end of the room, away from where most people are sitting. So I'll try it from here and see how I do. I mean, in a way, my mandate for the next 12 to 15 minutes, and I won't go on longer than that, is to explain why we're here discussing the what to do about the Electoral College, given how serious I think, and many people think, and most people think, the flaws are It's like, why do we, and that was the title of my book. Why do we still have the Electoral College? And I think that we're going to have copies of the book available for everybody. The key person who's in the know, or two key people just nodded. So for those of you who are registered for the conference, you will get free copies of the book, but I'm going to now give you a highly condensed version. I had originally offered as the conference to actually read my book. It's a mere 440 pages, and Archon told me to keep it short. So let me just try to cap these headlines, because I think they are relevant to the discussions that we want to have about the future. First, there have been an enormous number of efforts to get rid of the Electoral College or to reform it, and they date back to 1802, maybe even a little bit earlier. As my friend and fellow historian Jack Rakove commented in writing his book, the Electoral College was obsolete by the end of the 1790s already, because it was created in a world where they did not envision political parties. There have been more than 1,000 amendments introduced into Congress to get rid of or reform the Electoral College, more than on any other subject in American history. Here we, and you may have noticed, right here we are. The one amendment was passed, the 12th Amendment, which made a significant change, but it doesn't really affect the concerns that we have today. The earliest efforts to get rid of the Electoral College, and I want to just focus on a couple of big themes in this long and complicated story. But the earliest efforts focused on, the Electoral College, as George mentioned, by 1802, it wasn't working as intended. There was no deliberation. These people weren't sort of, pondering who the best person would be. But the earliest efforts focused on getting rid of winner take all, or the unit rule, which we have. That is not in the Constitution. And it was really not the intent of most of the framers, maybe all of the framers. They envisioned districts primarily as a way of allocating electors, but they decided to let the states experiment. And in that experimentation, and once there were parties, the parties began, partisan interests within each state began to adopt winner take all as a way of maximizing their own advantage, right? This was not part of the design, but it became an extremely important part of the operation. So that the early proposals focused on getting rid of that and getting rid of the contingent system. And again, we have to put ourselves back in the early 19th century. We think of the contingent system as this weird oddity which hasn't happened in 200 years. And so what, should we deal with it or not? But the fact is that in the early 19th century, and the framers themselves, they thought it would be very common. They thought that many, if not most, elections would go to the contingent system. And the contingent system is profoundly undemocratic, as we've already talked about. In the 18-teens and 1820s, we came very close to agreement on a constitutional amendment that would have required elections, for one thing, because under the Constitution, and even now, the state legislature can choose electors by itself. There doesn't have to be a popular election in each state, but it required elections, required allocation of electors by district, and then it also would have redone the contingent system so that each member of Congress, not just each House delegation, got one vote. It was a trade really between the large states, which would give up something by giving up winner take all, and the small states, which would give up something by giving up the contingent system, which greatly benefited them. I mean, the real defense in the Electoral College of small states is not the little additional weight from the senators. It was designed to be the contingent system. They came very close to cutting that deal. A few votes in the House of Representatives made the difference. They got it passed through the Senate 4 or 5 times, but they couldn't quite get it through. district elections remained a popular reform throughout the 19th century. But as gerrymandering became increasingly loony, district elections lost favor. So that's my point one about the early period of reform and district elections. Second, the idea of a national popular vote, okay, first appears in Congress in 1816. Okay, it appears very early. It wasn't like they were opaque about this, and it was championed by many people over the next century and a half. And let me give you one headline in advance of telling you the real story, but one headline to dispense with a kind of conventional wisdom that is false. It is not the small states that have blocked the passage of a national popular vote. Okay, I can say two pieces of evidence on that. The number of times when it came up to approving a national popular vote in one branch of Congress, the roll call votes indicate that small states voted the same way as other states. They voted for other reasons, didn't have to do with size. Second, notably, some of the most important advocates of a national popular vote in Congress, probably a majority of the most important advocates, have been from small states. Okay, this was not New York trying to ride roughshod over North Dakota. In fact, in the 1940s, the leading champion of a national popular vote was from North Dakota. But what made a national popular vote impossible to pass or difficult to pass, and really a non-starter for most of our history, was racial supremacy, was white supremacy in the South. While there was slavery, as was alluded to already, Southern states would have lost a lot of weight in presidential elections if there was a popular vote, because if there's a popular vote, only voters count, not the 3/5 of African Americans who count towards electoral votes but don't vote. So you would eliminate that strength in the South. What's less well known is that the situation became even more extreme after the Civil War. After the Civil War, a brief period of Reconstruction, when white supremacy is restored to the South. And at that point, in effect, white Southerners benefited from what you could call the 5/5 clause. African Americans counted 100% towards representation in Congress and towards electoral votes, but they didn't vote at all. So in fact, the South was advantaged by this. And the South would have lost a great deal of influence in presidential elections if there had been a switch to a national popular vote from the Electoral College system, which gave them weight and power regardless of the narrowness of the franchise that they offered. And Southerners vehemently opposed it. There were books written to Southern audiences that the Electoral College was one of the most important bulwarks to preserve the Southern way of life. And this shows up very vividly and consequentially in 1969-70, in the episode where we came closest to abolishing the Electoral College and adopting a national popular vote, when a constitutional amendment passed the House by an 82% vote. Now imagine that. The current Congress could not get an 82% on what day it is. But they got an 82% vote in favor of a national popular vote, and they had a majority in the Senate. But over the course of a year, it was stalled, and then it was killed by a Southern filibuster. Okay, so that's sort of the second big block of the story. The third is that since that time, since about the 1980s, Electoral College reform has been blocked for partisan reasons, and this is the only sustained period when that was true. Okay, it's not true in other periods, partly because of the configurations of the parties. But the Republican Party began to believe in the 1980s that it had a, quote, lock, this was their phrase, lock on the Electoral College. And obviously, in recent years, they've been reading election results and noticing they're not doing very well in the popular vote, and thus strenuously oppose switching to a national popular vote. And again, as we alluded to last time, I mean, even the former president changed his position. And Republican opposition has really prevented serious efforts in Congress. And, no member of Congress, I mean, I've talked to a number of members of Congress including one who was supporting national popular vote in 2006. And, nobody wants to spend all their time and energy sort of within Congress trying to mobilize people behind something which they know cannot win because of the vehement opposition of the other party. Now, let me end this on a brighter note, which I alluded to last time. I mean, I know this story, I've written a book about, 220 years of defeat. But let me end on a note of optimism. It's Sid, don't invest in any stocks that I buy. But what's notable from the historical record is that the times that we have come closest to electoral college reform were times when the party systems were in flux. The 18 teens, 1820s, there's only one party, the Republican Party. It has 4 different factions or 5 different factions, but the Federalists had disappeared. There was no bipartisan, there was no sort of simple partisan dichotomization of the political system. And the second time, the 1969 episode that I was referring to, is also a period when I would argue there was really no effective 2-party system. The party system was in flux. Southern whites were leaving the Democratic Party and entering the Republican Party. The Republican Party was beginning to go through its own changes, partly as a result of the Southern whites moving into the Republican Party. And so that party flux seems to open up space for possible electoral college reform, okay? And I don't have a crystal ball, and leaders of different Republican factions in Washington rarely consult me about their plans. But it does seem to me that we are looking at a moment when there will be a good chance of some kind of party realignment after the 2024 election. That as non-MAGA Republicans are trying to figure out what to do, both of the non-MAGA Republicans. But I mean, there are serious constituencies out there which no longer feel at home. Liz Cheney has said very, very clearly that they're looking at various alternatives, but they're not going to do anything before the 2024 election because they don't want to do something that would hurt Biden and help Trump. And so that we may be entering a moment when, despite the pessimism I alluded to earlier, when there might be an opportunity for serious change coming sooner than we might otherwise imagine. Fingers crossed. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Danielle has to, do you want to take one question for you?
Yeah. So any questions? I won't hold the room for very much longer because it's getting late in the evening, but we'll be able to continue informally. Yeah, Jack.
George, I admired almost everything you said, but one point puzzled me. I may not have fully understood what you were saying, but I've always thought that the strongest impetus of the American political system, be a 2-party system, was presidential elections. I mean, it just places an enormous emphasis on coordination in order to capture the one office. If we had a parliamentary system in a country of this size and diversity, I always assumed we would with the ministerial system, in the British model, whatever, I always assumed we'd wind up with coalition governments. Maybe not as bad as Italy, at its worst moments, but maybe 3 or 4 or 5 parties, which would have to bargain things out. And I may not have understood fully what you said, but I wonder if you could clarify.
Well, we have in political science, there's a literature, starting with a French scholar named Duverger, and who looked at 2 ways, to elect people: single member district or multiple member district, which was common in Europe. And he found that single member district is the key. It is the key. And so I think that remains for the United States, and a single member district for the presidency would certainly follow in that and get the same benefits. It creates the same incentives. There was just nothing, you get nothing for coming in 3rd or 4th, whereas a multi-member district, you get something, because if you get 20% of the vote, you might get a seat, right? You only have to get 20% of the vote. Well, under the Electoral College, you can get things by coming in really badly, but you can still win. So there's incentives on the Electoral College to splinter, where there's not under direct election.
How about over here?
So I'm curious, in a room full of policymakers talking about the Electoral College, how many other folks do I have who live in the Midwest in this room? Cool. So just to Professor Allen's point, I absolutely feel better represented by Tammy Duckworth or Tammy Baldwin than I do by New York or California Democrats. And I'm wondering, sort of taking our word as Midwesterners that there is some unique regional interest, and I probably agree with Republicans in the Midwest on some things more than coastal Democrats. Like, how would you sort of respond to that in a question of how we elect president? Is there a way to sort of preserve regional representation in something other than Electoral College that gives us sort of a unique voice in national conversations?
Well, that's a great question. I have to admit, I haven't proactively considered, a whole other alternative, if you see what I mean. But I think that's a great way to ask the question, because that's what we're trying to solve for. And I think we're trying to solve for that issue, coupled with the realpolitik point that Alex was making about a moment of kind of party flux and indeterminacy. And so that's the challenge. Like, at the end of the day, it's literally a negotiation for some sort of stable system for having a shared executive. And so that's why it's so messy in the Constitutional Convention. That's why, at the end of the day, it's not actually precisely clear how it articulates with matters of political principle. I would disagree with you, George. It is political equality, but the political equality is at the level of your membership in a state, not at the federal union level. It's all one vote per person at the state level. And that was the original sort of sense of affiliation and membership. So that's why it's kind of conceptually complicated as well. So I would encourage you to think about that question. And so I would love to hear some ideas about that sort of regional point of view. But again, so what we do have is broken. So in that regard, I think putting an additional question on the table like that would be very helpful.
I have a comment. May I?
Sure.
Yeah. And you're from Wisconsin?
From Wisconsin.
Yeah, okay, because I lived in Wisconsin. I went to graduate school there, so I know a fair amount about Wisconsin. At any rate, you have your regional interest. There's not, as you well know, in Wisconsin, there's not one view, right? You would agree with me on that, right? Okay. So what happens is, though, if one side gets one vote more in Wisconsin, then that regional interest switches, right? Well, that's silly. I mean, it's just nonsense. That doesn't make any sense. And there are quite divergent views in Wisconsin, right, of what the interests are. So the only way that you can represent those interests accurately is by not voting by state. If you vote by state, you distort the interest. That's what happens. Now, even more now, I would make a couple of other points. First of all, we used to say Tip O'Neill, right? I don't have to tell you what Tip O'Neill said. All politics is local. Now all politics is national. And so we're really talking about different things. Are the issues in presidential elections state issues? Is that what they do? Do they go to small states? Well, they don't go to small states. They don't do anything with small states. Are they talking about small state interest, whatever the heck that may be, which I'm saying there isn't any? But I mean, they don't. That's not what happens. So you can't vote as a member of a small state or any state, for that state interest. There's rarely such a thing. One could imagine Nevada and the storage of nuclear waste. I mean, that's a unique thing to one place, right? And even then, the candidates weren't responsive. They weren't necessarily responsive to Nevada's clearly stated interest in not having nuclear waste stored there. So, and one other thing regarding all this, I don't know what they do in Western Massachusetts, so I wouldn't pretend to tell you what they do in Western Massachusetts, but we do know a lot about campaigning across the nation. And you go where the votes are. You go but there are votes everywhere, and you campaign, and it's cheaper to advertise in small areas. It's to take your campaign. If you can't take it physically, you take it other ways. There's other ways you take campaigns. And so they do. I mean, we know a lot about campaigning. I mean, you don't have stealth campaigns for office. So we have virtually perfect information. We know what people do. So Western Massachusetts, I think, is an outlier here. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about the weatherman, but
Just one more question and then we'll be able to chat informally after this. Yeah, go ahead.
And thank you for talking about the cost of campaigns. The 2020 election was the most expensive in history, with total expenditures around 14.4 billion, which was double than what was spent in the presidential election in 2016. So as we are working on the topic of debunking some of the reasons why the Electoral College might be preferable, and knowing that right now, presidential candidates only campaign in certain states or certain communities to build their win number. What do you think a popular vote would do to the cost of elections, and potentially how it impacts candidates who are women or people of color that potentially would be dissuaded from running because it is that much more difficult for them to raise campaign funds?
I guess this is at me.
Yes.
I hope so.
Well, I think that it's entirely possible that it would cost more because I think there'd be more campaigning. And if you follow my argument that there'd be a broader campaign, there would be but you wouldn't necessarily have to run more ads, you just have them less concentrated. Instead of having Florida completely flooded, inundated with ads, you might take some of that money and advertise more broadly. And I think you would. Now, whether or not, but I think it's possible that it would campaign more. I mean, excuse me, cost more to campaign. Now, you ask about, would it discourage candidate, and we're talking about a presidential election now, okay? So I don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether women, whether Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, since we have two excellent examples in recent history.
Exceptions.
Yeah, okay, well, okay. I can only go on, you know, the history, but I don't think they would have been discouraged. That's my reading of it. Discouraged if it would have been a broader campaign.
No, thank you. And for me, it's about how we build that argument, because what I see time and again, particularly in down ballot elections, is that it is more difficult for women and for candidates of color to raise campaign funds.
Yes.
And so how we build that to the presidential level is I think something we have to work through so we could explain it to the other folks.
Well, I think that's a very good point, and I'll ask you, could you help us?
All right. So we're going to have to wrap it up for the evening, but yeah, let's thank the panel. I was a little worried that there wouldn't be enough disagreement and debate, but I think we're off to a roiling start. We'll have a chance to take up this conversation in a few minutes at a reception that everybody is invited to, less formal format. And for instructions for that, where to go for that, and then also for a little preview of tomorrow, let me hand it over to Nick for last words.
Well, thank you, Archon, Danielle, George, and Alex, and also to all of you. I know folks traveled far and wide to be here from Iowa, California, Massachusetts. Not, thank you, but
Western
Really
Massachusetts.
appreciate the logistical hurdles that a lot of you accomplished to get here. So let me ask you this: do you feel like you know everything about the Interstate Compact based on today's conversation? Great, excellent. What about fractional allocation of electors? The district system. Great. So tomorrow, we're going to be kicking off the day with a panel led by the Ash Center's Tova Wang, where we're going to be addressing some of the finer points about these different approaches. We're going to be hearing from a number of scholars and advocates. So please come ready with your questions, your points of support and disagreement about these different reforms. But tonight, we're going to take the conversation next door to the Charles Hotel in the Longfellow Room. So all the staff and students from the Ash Center and the Kennedy School, can you please raise your hand? Okay. So these folks know where they're going. And so it's right next door in the Longfellow Room. And there's going to be an informal reception until about 8 o'clock. And there'll be food and beverage. Tomorrow, we're back in this room. So you can't get lost. You know exactly where you're going. The door will be open from 8 until 9 a.m. And then there'll be staff to let you in if you come after 9. That first hour, 8 to 9, is going to be an informal breakfast. There's no program, but do come because there'll be a delicious serving of breakfast items and talk to your colleagues at the conference. So we're going to break for now. And thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you. Really